In Chapter 6, we will discuss Native Americans. First, I'd like you to think about Native Americans and the images that come to mind. What have you seen, heard, or what do you know about Native Americans? Native Americans are the indigenous people of now called America. They are the first victims of European colonization on this continent. And again, Native Americans are now seen as a monolith, as one type, but the indigenous people consist of hundreds of Native American groups. Incredible diversity. They're called collectively and erroneously Indians by conquerors, and again, they are the sufferers of the hands of white intruders. Again, the first immigrants coming to the United States. European explorers were latecomers, so the idea that Christopher Columbus discovered America is a fallacy. The continent was already inhabited by millions of people. And the continent was discovered by some scholars at least 20,000 years earlier. And they say this is due to migration across a land bridge from Asia to Alaska. Analysts estimate the indigenous population was about 1 million. Some, however, argue that the estimations are closer to 15 million at the time of conquest. The low figures have sometimes been used to legitimize European conquests of allegedly unoccupied land. So imagine North and South America being populated with only 1 million people. It doesn't seem as much, but if you think about it as 15 million, it is. It's already inhabited, people are already here, but again, rationalization will justify exploitation and genocide. By 1890, the combined effects of disease and violence reduced indigenous numbers to about 250,000. The 2000 census reported that about 2.5 million people identified as American Indians. About 1 million of this population identified as white and Indian, whereas about 180,000 people identified as black and Indian. So we have to consider at one point in history people tried to not claim their Native American ancestry, indigenous ancestry, because of discrimination. However, now people are claiming their Native American ancestry, either that they know it or not. And we have to ask our questions, why is this? But again, the major Native American tribes, nations in America before colonization were the Cherokees, Navajo, Choctaw, Sioux, and Chippewa. Only 36% of Native Americans live on reservations and land trust lands, and most Native Americans now live in towns or cities. Native Americans are often called subordinated people, again, subordinated to European colonizers. The term Indian and other government names for major Native American groups were created by whites. These groups are not recorded under the original names in history, such as the Navajo called themselves the Dene, which means the people. Renaming results from subordination, and this again suggests one major difference between those who are colonized and those who came here as voluntary immigrants. Colonized people often have little control over the group naming process. Non-Indians think of Indians as a single category. However, this monolithic group, this racialized group, is incredibly diverse with lots of major differences between each group. So conquest is what we're going to discuss now. Human migration varies from voluntary movement to forced slave importation. In the case of Native Americans, however, the dominant group itself migrated. Europeans moved into the territories of indigenous groups, and this process is called colonization migration. If we look at this map, we see this is what the country would look like if the major tribal nations were still where they're supposed to be located. And where Kansas is, we have the Sioux Pawnee nations. Often Native Americans are considered to be tribal or savage, uncolonized, uncivilized people. But in reality, Europeans borrowed a lot from Native American culture. Cultures in Native American societies are more highly developed than some European societies. They had complex and sophisticated systems of government, community organizations, economy, and means of communication. During the first decade of English settlement, numerous colonists deserted to Native American communities in search of better living conditions. And what they found, and what we know now, is that many of these tribal groups are matrilineal, which means usually a lot of the leadership is held by women. We also see in a lot of these tribal groups that there's no social class, no state, and little economic specialization. And specifically in terms of the culture that was borrowed by Europeans, 60% of the foods, such as potatoes, corns, and many grains, eaten by people around the globe today were first developed by indigenous people in the Western Hemisphere. Many medicinal plants and their derivatives, such as quinine, were borrowed from Native Americans. One of the atrocities that Native American peoples have faced is, of course, relocation and genocide. This forced migration is known as the Trail of Tears. Thousands of Cherokees, Creeks, Chickasaws, Choctaws, and Seminoles were relocated from their eastern lands to the so-called Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma. And now we have internal migration since then. Over the past century, this has involved relocation of Native Americans from reservations and other rural areas to cities. And again, those who are moving to the cities are doing it because of things like work or to go to school. During the colonial period, white historians asserted that the Native Americans were hostile. And they again did not see Native Americans as people, and they had a scarce resource of land, which equates to wealth, that they were using the Native Americans for. European colonists slowly gained dominance over time. At first, Native Americans helped them to survive in the new continent, but over time they forced Native Americans into frontier areas or simply just killed them. Few whites were concerned about the genocidal consequences of expansion, as we talked previously about manifest destiny. If you're a white European immigrant and you have nothing, they're not going to be too concerned about the situation for other groups. So European colonists developed various strategies for dealing with those whose land they coveted. It ranged from honest treaty making with equals to deceptive treaty making to attempts at extermination to enslavement like that of Africans to confinement in often barren prison-like areas called reservations. So let's talk about treaties. Treaties are defined as are described as a procedure that was very dishonest. It was not one of immediate expropriation of land, but rather of constant encroachment by whites, a gradual land taking process sanctioned after the fact by the government treaties. So again, when you are not writing the laws or treaties for yourself, it puts you in a subordinate position and it gives power to the dominant group. So if you look at this cartoon here, although it's in humor, we still have this issue today. And one Native American says here, the question is, are they here legally? Talking about the new immigrant group coming in, the Europeans. And the other Native person says, I guess we'll just have to wait till they write the laws. So that just shows you that when you're in power, you can write laws that benefit your group. So again, in terms of justifying what's going on, Indians or Native people were viciously stereotyped and attacked in the Declaration of Independence. By action or inaction, federal officials supported theft of Native American lands. And subordination was even supported by President Andrew Jackson. He was a slaveholding president critical of treaty making. He encouraged states to defy Supreme Court rulings favoring Native Americans and passed the Indian Removal Act of 1830. This was voluntary or forced removal of Native Americans, which resulted in the Trail of Tears, where large numbers of Native people died and those relocated to places like Oklahoma. So there's a lot of myths about Native Americans and European interactions, and we can see these myths often in movies and in television. So we often see this myth of warrior-like, savage, brutal Native American, and it's been seen over and over again in television and in movies, where it's almost a myth, an American myth. About 250,000 whites journeyed across the plains to the West Coast, which is true. However, fewer than 2 in every 1,000 died at the hands of Native Americans. And in these movies and television shows, we see these warrior-driven, warlike people coming to conquer the innocent people coming from the east to the west. In 1840 to 1860, totals of only 362 whites and 426 Native Americans died in all recorded battles along the wagon trail route. So it's not as prolific of a number of battles that we think of. However, it's not the case that we see that in media. The recurring pattern in conflict between whites and Native Americans was a result of white farmers moving into Native American lands, and U.S. government would, by threat or force, coercion, resettle Native Americans to other places. And lastly, many treaties, still part of the U.S. law, are masterpieces of fraud. So if there was conflict, it's because Native American lands were taken from them. The U.S. government would use force to remove them, and then treaties were dishonest. So what is more true is that white settlers massacred many Native Americans. Serious treaty violations by whites again led to conflict, and after the Civil War, with government support, railroad corporations usurped land in the West. So just imagine you're living in a community, and this is modern times, living in a community, and the government had agreed to put a new transportation system through the middle of your city, or put in a train system to the middle of your city. And that's what happened to a lot of Native American communities. The new trains came in and they had to move, or they will be wiped out anyway. Conflicts over illegal white invasion escalated. Troops sent in to force Sioux and other smaller reservations to move. And we have Colonel George A. Custer at Little Bighorn in 1876 is one of the most widely known battles of the plains. And in this battle, Custer and his soldiers wiped out by a Sioux group and its allies who refused to settle on reservations. So here we see one time where Native Americans resisted and won. Wounded Knee Creek took place 14 years later, and approximately 300 Native Americans were killed while running from the camp, and many of these who were killed were old men, women, and children. So again, we have one victory compared to hundreds of defeats. So we often have these old images to justify the subordination and discrimination against Native Americans still perpetuated in today's imagery. So after the arrival of European colonizers, the stereotypes were spread to make sure everyone held the same ideologies, that Native Americans were savages. Some of the stereotypes included that Native Americans were lazy and wild, and Europeans, conversely, were virtuous and hardworking. This, along with a group classification by physical characteristics, served to distinguish colonizers from the colonized. And some of the differences, again, were skin color. Native American people were known for having supposedly red skins, and we even have a football team now, at least professionally named, the Redskins, which is very derogatory. They're known for supposedly being very wild and not wearing clothes and things like that. They also have some positive stereotypes mixed in with some negative stereotypes, such as a child of nature or noble savage. It's a European myth that was a mixture of appreciation and an anti-Indian prejudice. So they're noble in that they are strong and taking care of their group, but savage in that they live in the wild, they don't speak English, they don't dress like them, they don't practice Christianity. So violent resistance reinforced white stereotypes of the Indian savage. So when Native Americans did defend themselves to protect their families or what they considered as their land, it just proved to the Europeans that they were driven by war and violence. The era of westward expansion imprinted on the white mind the image of a cruel Indian warrior attacking helpless white families. And again, this has been perpetuated in popular novels and later in films. And again, this is an erroneous image. The primitive hunter who made little use of the land is what was again used to justify discrimination. And Native Americans don't have the idea of ownership like Westerners do. And Native Americans were part-time or full-time farmers. Again, they went with the seasons. They followed where the food was, so they didn't just settle down and build suburbs and drive to their jobs. So it's not like what we understand. Another type of imagery, racist stereotypes, concern women. And again, if those who really love Disney, this is not going to be pleasant for you. So one of the stereotypes is a princess, and we see this in Pocahontas. She saves a white man from her own people. She's portrayed slightly darker with European features in books and movies, as we see here. And the squaw is another female stereotype. It's a white man's sexual partner. She's portrayed as darker, fatter, and cruder, with traits of drunkenness, stupidity, and thievery. Research of textbooks in elementary and high school and college found numerous stereotypes. And textbooks now deal at least briefly with indigenous peoples, but often only in the past. And we often still think of Native American peoples in the past, if we ever do see them in textbooks or any kind of media. So back to Pocahontas. The sad truth about her is that she wasn't a 20-something-year-old woman who saved the white colonizers. She was actually a 10 to 12-year-old girl. And her life included kidnapping and rape by whites, a trip to England, marriage to a white planter, and early death from disease. But life was not that. So my favorite time of the year is coming up, Halloween. I love how we can go and be childlike and dress up and things like that. But another bad part that comes along with Halloween is, putting on ethnic clothing to represent these myths, these images that are not true, and just to kind of laugh at it, take it off, and go back to your regular life the next day. So today's stereotypes are very commonplace and have serious consequences, so it's not just playful. It's not just making a joke, because these kinds of images and myths actually do have consequences, such as more discrimination in policing and arrest and sentencing by white officials. Native Americans are overrepresented in prisons and juvenile facilities than whites, and receive harsher sentences when they are convicted compared to whites. Some of the stereotypes that we see is the drunken Indian, and it's the most extreme. And if we really do the statistics, we find that few Native Americans today have this problem. Only 5.8% of Native Americans are considered alcoholics, compared to 5.1% of whites. So this is not a statistically significant difference. Another stereotype is that all Native American peoples own casinos and they're doing just fine. However, there's a high rate of poverty. So 25% of Native American peoples fall below the federal poverty line. So we're talking about the poor, the poorest of the poor. So in terms of social institutions, we're going to focus on politics. Native American cultures and societies before European influence were very civilized, but again, it's not the same as what European politics or civilization looks like. At an initial contact, most Native American societies were at least as old and as developed as European societies. And again, many indigenous societies were egalitarian, so again, there weren't class divisions or patriarchy or things like that happening. Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and other leaders admired Native American democratic institutions, and we again adopted some of these things, such as the American symbol of the eagle clutching arrows was copied from the Iroquois nation. However, we don't see this, that they had a strong sense of politics, because again, whites wrote Native American history. The victors write history. So again, at first, colonizers dealt with Native Americans as independent nations. They needed them. As colonizers gained strength, they treated nations as groups to be exterminated or as dependent wards. So again, not needing them. The Bureau of Indian Affairs was established to coordinate federal regulations with Native Americans. Basically, the BIA became wardens over Native Americans on reservations. Its work ranged from authoritarian supervision of reservations to provision of supplies. So again, acting as wardens and giving them what they needed. And again, what they needed was determined by the white colonizers, not by Native American peoples themselves. Traditional Native American leaders were replaced by white-controlled Native American leaders. So again, they don't even have sovereignty over themselves. They can't make their own decisions. And later this developed into a trust relationship, trusting that they would take care of them. So in 1887, the Dawes Act was passed. It provided that reservation lands be divided among individual families. And Native American people, again, did not live that way. They didn't understand ownership the same way. Everything was communal. European tradition of private ownership, development of lands was an alien value system to Native Americans. In 1884, John Elk, a Native American, tried to vote. However, the Supreme Court ruled that he was not eligible to vote, and took place in Omaha, Nebraska, because he was a citizen of a foreign nation, because he is from a reservation. In 1924, Congress passed the Indian Citizenship Act. So it took quite a while for things to start changing. In 1934, the Indian Reorganization Act was passed and was intended to establish Indian civil and cultural rights, a law for semi-autonomous tribal governments, and foster economic development on reservations. In 1946, the Indians Claim Commission was set up to deal with numerous claims on treaty violations and received numerous claims for compensation of land. And again, this was not an act or an organization that was set up by Native American peoples for Native American peoples. It was, again, white controlled. So in the first decade, most claims were denied. In 1950, the House Concurrent Resolution 108 was passed and called for termination of federal supervision of Indian groups. So trying to break free from that control. So, however, in 1960s, President Richard Nixon called on Congress to maintain Native American close ties with federal government and prohibit any termination without consent. So even when Native American peoples are trying to gain agency and sovereignty, the U.S. would do certain things to not make that happen or to take it back. So the BIA, again, government controlled, defines who's an Indian by determining which tribal groups are officially acknowledged by government. So you can be a federally recognized Native American and supposedly get all the benefits of that because the government will support you supposedly, or you could be Native American and not have that federal recognition. There's pros and cons to each of those. The government-controlled process of defining who is Indian and what is a tribe is one as emphasized by racial formation theorists. Again, who gets to define the race and ethnicity of a group? Growing numbers of Native Americans have called on to end that BIA control and work for recognition of their sovereign nations. So instead of having an outside entity control them, they want to rule themselves, to make their own decisions. So in terms of Native American participation in politics, it's still small, but we see that it's effective in certain areas. For Native Americans on reservations, political participation is often directed at reservation elections and service in tribal government. So they're having more self-rule on reservations and in areas where there's a higher population of Native Americans. Native Americans have difficulty voting in national elections throughout history. Again, sometimes various citizenship acts, one passed in 1924, barred some Native people in some states to even voting. And if they did vote, they had to pass literacy tests to vote. Native Americans running for political office has increased. And this is in areas in the Southwest, most likely, because that's where they're more populous. Native Americans have made contributions to political campaigns and influence on legislation. And over the last decade or so, U.S. Supreme Court has handed down a series of major decisions that limit political and judicial power of reservation governments. So we see all these benefits, and again, the government gets involved and takes back that power. So to fight for more power, more freedom, there have been protests and conflicts. Native Americans against the government entities that are controlling them. And we see one of these forces happening in the late 60s, the Red Power movement. It's a term that appeared during a time of expanded Native American activism in the 1960s. And those involved with the Red Power movement engaged in civil disobedience. Very similar to what we saw with the Black Power movement in the late 60s and early 70s. In 1968, the American Indian movement was formed and organized to address problems ranging from police brutality to discrimination, housing, and employment. They organized an occupation of Wounded Knee in South Dakota in attempts to fight against the government and how they're trying to sabotage them. In attempts to convict the AIM, the government used police state tactics, and the case was dismissed. So they are trying to stop the uprising of Native American resistance and power. A major issue that we still see today is concerning mascots. Just imagine having your ethnic or racialized group used as just an entertainment icon, as a mascot, where your traditions, your culture, your beliefs were not recognized, but rather your imagery is used to just pump up the crowd. You're now an object instead of a person. So anti-Indian racism in sports mascots is what we're going to focus on. The American Indian movement and other groups have protested the use of Native American names, sacred symbols, and gestures by sports teams. What we see in common entertainment, sports entertainment, is parodies of sacred chants, face paint headdresses, and drums for entertainment purposes. These things are taken by Indians as assaults to their culture, in part because most of these have spiritual significance. Such imagery and actions are often lumped highly diverse Native Americans to one undifferentiated group, whose stereotype portrayal is mostly a fictionalized invention of the white imagination. So again, it's very sacred. So imagine taking your spiritual beliefs and using it to pump up a crowd. So right now we're all going to start praying or chanting. We are going to use Star of Davids or crucifixes as face paint. Redskins, Chiefs, and Braves with associated caricatures involve offensive anti-Indian images and stereotypes. The National Coalition on Racism in Sports and the Media has joined protesters. However, today, many colleges and universities still use Indian logos. Even our local high school here, the Manhattan Indians, still use these types of imagery. Driving down Bluemont and that roundabout, what do you see? A Native American man. I wonder if Native Americans had any kind of say if that image would be there and what it would look like. I suspect not. Another thing that Native American groups had protested was for fishing rights and land claims. Fishing rights and land claims provided conflict between Native Americans and whites in several states. For instance, the U.S. versus State of Washington, 1974, ruled that indigenous rights reserved by treaties are different from those allowed whites and ordered the state to protect Indian anglers, so fishermen. Native American Rights Fund, or NARF, is a nonprofit National League defense firm. It has represented various tribes in lawsuits and negotiations. And human rights groups have also worked to document and reduce the substantial racial harassment and violence targeting Native Americans. Again, using the law to their benefit. We see more activism and self-determination. The National Museum of American Indian Act authorized construction of a museum on the mall in Washington, D.C. to bring together Smithsonian's dispersed collection of Native American sacred objects. This museum is mostly under Native American control. This act requires extensive government holdings of Native American funerary objects and burial remains to be returned. And just imagine, your ancestors are buried, and archaeologists or some other group of people come in, dig up your grave, your ancestor's grave, remove the bones and other artifacts without your permission, and put it into various museums or various exhibits. And then people come in and paid for a ticket just to kind of look at your ancestors for a second and move on. Again, the spiritual significance, the sacred objects lose their importance. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act requires museums to notify Native American groups of government holdings of Native American objects and to facilitate the return. So finally, having the right, the agency to take back the bodies and artifacts from your own group. We've talked about this before with Manifest Destiny. It's the idea that the U.S. had a right to expand from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific and would inevitably do so. Economic exploitation accompanied growth of industrial capitalization and urbanization. We see encroachment of Native American lands by white lumbering, ranching, railroad interests, etc. And resources were redirected from rural Native American lands to fuel growth in cities. And because of this, poverty on reservations occurred. It was rooted in destruction of local economies and mismanagement by BIA officials. So in terms of scarce resources that create wealth, we have extraction of a lot of course, the theft of land, extraction of minerals and other raw resources. Native Americans' lands hold about 30% of coal reserves, 40% of uranium reserves, and 4% of oil and gas reserves. That is a lot of money. That is wealth. Historically, whites have benefited the most from extracting such resources. Native Americans often do not get any kind of profit from this. The Council of Energy Resources Tribes was developed in the 1970s and provided technical and financial assistance to help member groups control their energy resources so they're not being exploited. This brought new jobs and increased income to numerous communities. We still see that in Native American communities there are persisting economic problems. With urban migration, the proportion in farm occupations has dropped dramatically from 68% in the 1940s to about 1.6% today. So again, farmers have decreased tremendously. Urban workers have usually been concentrated in the secondary labor market, and this sector is characterized by job instability, low wages, and little mobility, and disproportionately non-white. So again, these are not the middle class or upper class jobs that we go to college just to do. Native Americans are less likely than U.S. workers as a group to hold managerial or professional positions. So those middle and upper middle class positions are not what Native American peoples are doing. So again, the unemployment rate for Native American workers, at least in the time from 2006 to 2008, was 12%. Then about twice the natural unemployment rate at 6.4%. Between that time and 2010, both rates increased substantially. For decades, Native Americans have often had the lowest median family income and per capita income of any major racial or ethnic umbrella group. 25.3, so a quarter of Native Americans, including Alaskans, live below the federal poverty line. So think about what things are connected to poverty. Things that are connected to poverty are inadequate living conditions, inadequate nutrition, higher mortality rates, diseases such as diabetes and tuberculosis, and stress from years of racial discrimination, which also lead to health difficulties. So in terms of recent economic development, we see growing self-determination movement and recognition of tribal sovereignty in courts. Many Indian nations have developed new economic enterprises and improved local economies. And we see this through profits from gaming, which has been the first regular income for some groups. And over recent decades, Mississippi Band and Choctaw Nation were successful in developing industrial parks that have attracted Fortune 500 companies. So when you bring in businesses, you bring in sales tax revenues, and also people go and live in areas where there are businesses. So again, we have property taxes also improving the economy. The Cherokee Nation Industries use gaming profits to build plants that manufacture cable boxes and also just plain cables, which of some have been used on the International Space Station. Some economic opportunities are sometimes rejected is landfills. So landfill space for outside garbage or nuclear waste is used as a way to have economic profits or opportunities. And Native American land is attractive to some companies or some businesses because of low population density and not generally subject to state environmental regulations and taxes. So to evade the law and taxes, various groups will want to put their trash on Native American lands. And this type of dumping is often called environmental racism. It's government and private dumping in communities populated by Americans of color, usually poor Americans of color. So what should Native American people do? Take the trash and gain a little bit of economic opportunity, or say no and not gain this short-term economic advantage? If they say yes, that trash comes into communities along with disease. If they say no, they have to find some other means to take care of their needs, to take care of their community. Education is another institution that has affected the Native American peoples. Influential whites supported education as a channel to force acculturation, so changing the Native American peoples in a way that they become more white. And enforced acculturation was a reoccurring issue in BIA and public schools. So as indoctrination, again, these children were taken from their families, put into these boarding schools, and physically had to change the way they looked by cutting off their hair, wearing a certain type of dress. They could not speak their Native American tongues. They could not worship anything but Christianity. If they did not follow these instructions, they were physically punished. They were either beaten or put in sweat boxes. Again, they're trying to better or civilize these Native American people. But in the end, they just destroyed their culture. If these children wanted to go back home, there was so much change, so much assimilation, that they were no longer like their families. There was a disconnect. So the organizations have protested these type of schools, and this has resulted in the decline of BIA schools. The U.S. Department of Education Task Force was local and federal education systems have said that local and federal education systems have failed to meet the needs of Native American students. Imagine again, you're in an environment you're not familiar with, and you and your teacher do not share the same language or the same culture, and you're expected to know certain things. If you've never been exposed to those things, of course you would do poorly, and then your teacher would see you as deficient or stupid. Native American educational attainment levels are below the general population. And again, this can be resulting from numerous reasons, such as cultural differences, from poverty, from hunger, and things like that. So next important institution is religion. Native American groups periodically or pressure museums and other facilities to return religious and art objects. They have protested display of Native American skeletal remains in museums and called for their return for proper burial ceremonies. Pressure to adapt to American culture, clear in the case of religion. Again, we see that with the boarding schools. White conquerors often tried to convert heathen Indians to Christianity. Only a minority of Native American peoples identify with Christianity. What we see is now millenarian movement. It's often led by visionaries oriented to a golden age in which supernatural events will change oppressive conditions. And we see practices such as ghost dances occurring there. We see peyote rituals. A new religion spread through the plains between 1880 and 1900 and reflected ambivalence toward Christianity. And in 1918 is accepted as a distinctive Christian group. Most traditional religious beliefs and practices of Native Americans are not exclusive. Some Native Americans believe that a person can be both a traditional believer and a Christian. So from the assimilation perspective, an opportunity to assimilate was more open for Native Americans than other people of color. The assimilation model focuses on the extent to which traditional Native American cultures have undergone Europeanization. Living patterns and sense of Native American identity vary widely today. The Sioux and Navajo have a strong group identity, while others have lost their old ways and strong identities. Intensive, often forced acculturation efforts have failed to destroy indigenous cultures. And we see that we have persistence of traditional Indian languages. We see, like even in Lawrence, at Haskell University, the ability to learn Native American languages or to strengthen your native tongue if you do speak indigenous languages. Structural integration at other than low-paying jobs and economy has come slowly for Native Americans, so in this way they have not assimilated. Movement into economic mainstream did not begin until urban migration, so until Native Americans moved off the reservation to the towns and cities, did we see very much social mobility. Social integration at primary group level with white families has come slowly, especially for those on reservations. So again, with intermarriage occurred somewhat, between whites and Native American peoples. And again, if you live on a reservation, you're more likely to marry someone within your own group because that's who you're surrounded with. From the power conflict perspective, it says that many social science analysts argue that power conflict model is more relevant to Native American experience, and it accents deception, genocide, and land theft that was part of subordination process. This perspective stresses the reality of forced acculturation and incorporation process. It frequently accents the one-way character of social adaptation pressure. So, like our math problem, A plus B equals A. And we also see at all educational levels, Native American children face great one-way acculturation pressures again. They don't learn about their own culture. They're not taught by Native American peoples. And most capitulate to some degree with many thinking and behaving in white preferred ways. So to survive, if you're Native American in education, you have to assimilate in some capacity, maybe by having a double consciousness, by understanding the white preferred ways and performing them, and also trying to keep fast and authentic with your Native American traditions. Colonialism analysts stress that many Native Americans remain isolated politically and geographically, again, mostly in the Southwest or Oklahoma. Again, they're not integrated so much in all levels of politics. Many Native Americans are fighting against white oppression in various ways, from changing mascots to fighting police brutality to fighting education, neglecting their culture. Power conflict emphasizes the importance of struggle against white pressures and continuing racial oppression. Again, they are the first to have contact, whether by white settlers, and still today still fighting against oppression.